Welcome all. Thank you for joining the Partnership for Public Service and Microsoft today to discuss responsible AI and the findings of our research brief, In the Public AI, How Governments Can Apply Responsible AI Principles to Artificial Intelligence for Public Service Delivery. My name is Elizabeth Byers, and I'm an Associate Research Manager at the Partnership. I'll be joined shortly by a few experts for a discussion, but I first want to give an overview of the findings of the report, which the Partnership and Microsoft released in December. As we've all experienced, artificial intelligence-based tools are increasingly common in our interactions with the world. The algorithms that tell us what show to stream next, the chatbots we regularly interact with on websites. Many people have done great work on what it means to build and use AI in many different contexts in ethical, fair, and responsible ways. In this research, the Partnership and Microsoft wanted to look at how federal, state, and local governments in particular are thinking about their use of artificial intelligence from an ethics, fairness, and responsibility perspective. We specifically focused on AI for public service delivery, things like providing information about a government service, assisting in applying for a benefit, or answering customer questions. For this report, we spoke with government leaders, academics, and other experts to examine how federal, state, and local governments can apply the principles of responsible artificial intelligence to AI for public service delivery. Recognizing that technologists and data scientists are only one part of the puzzle when it comes to ensuring responsible AI use, we also looked at recommendations for how non-technical leaders can contribute to this work, as well as how technologists and non-technical leaders can collaborate. In our research, we heard from interviewees about the importance of keeping responsible AI principles in mind throughout the AI lifecycle, from the very first thought of potentially using AI through the building or buying and implementation of an AI tool, all the way to the routine day-to-day use of AI to deliver public services. Our report offers specific recommendations for government leaders, no matter their comfort or familiarity with AI, to consider at each of these stages. We also take a look at the organizational building blocks, things like governance structures, talent, and data infrastructure, that government entities need to have in place to create an environment that is concentrated on and capable of ensuring its use of artificial intelligence is responsible. I encourage you all to take a look at the report and read these recommendations in full. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists and get today's discussion started. Our first panelist, S. Craig Watkins, is the Ernest A. Sharp Centennial Professor and the Executive Director of the IC² Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. His research focuses on the intersections between race, equity, and technology. Craig is also one of the principal investigators for UT Austin's Good Systems Grand Challenge, a university-funded initiative to support multidisciplinary explorations of the technical, social, and ethical implications of artificial intelligence. He was also a visiting professor at MIT, where he continues to collaborate with faculty in the Institute for Data, Systems, and Society. Kevin Tupper is an experienced and dynamic technologist. He believes business and civil government can bring good to the world, and properly adopted technology can play an important part of this. Previously an AI ambassador and data and AI architect at Microsoft, Kevin now leads a cross-functional team of cloud solution architects with deep connections into Microsoft engineering and decades of combined experience in delivering secure, reliable, scalable, and cost-optimized solutions. Kevin also works with us at the Partnership as one of the speakers for our AI Federal Leadership Program. So I'd like to start off with a pretty broad question for both of you. So, first of all, what is responsible artificial intelligence? Can you give me some examples of specific principles or considerations that underlie responsible AI use? Craig, I'll start with you.
Sure, thank you, Liz, and happy to be here. I think over the years, as researchers have begun to sort of think about responsible, what some might refer to as ethical artificial intelligence, I guess there are a number of different, elements or components, key principles that might help give us broader kind of perspective, definition, and understanding. For example, this might be, AI that does not cause harm, or AI that does not practice bias or discrimination in any way. I think it's also an understanding of the need to sort of think thoroughly through the entire sort of development cycle, from the very beginning of a question or problem being engaged in terms of understanding how AI might be a solution or a mechanism for addressing that problem, whatever the problem space or domain might be. But then there's the entire cycle, right? Collecting the data that might inform the ways in which a model might work, developing mechanisms to understand and audit and assess the performance of that model, and of course its outputs and its implications for society as we begin to understand, AI more broadly speaking. And I think what brings us here today, and what's really critical in terms of responsible AI, is the degree, Liz, and the point that you made very importantly, is the extent to which these systems are now being used in very high stakes contexts: criminal justice, employment, education, public health. And so this idea, right, of being responsible to the public and responsible to the public good as we think about the development and deployment of these kinds of systems.
Kevin, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, for me, I like to have a working definition of things normally, and so a simple working definition I would think through for responsible AI is our development, as Craig was saying, the whole life cycle of that, and the deployment in line and congruous with society's ethics and values. And that's actually two discussions, right? So do we all have the same ethics and values? So that's a different discussion, but assuming we do, Microsoft has been a thought leader in that space of responsible AI and those principles for quite a while. And I don't want to necessarily belabor all those points, but two in particular, there's a couple of different pairs is the way I think about them. One, it would be the idea of fairness and inclusivity, and Craig mentioned fairness in terms of bias and non-discriminatory, or unbiased and non-discriminatory. I like to think of inclusivity as a pair of that, because when most of us think about biases or fairness, I should say, we're thinking about fairness within our limited field of vision. So inclusivity actually forces us, if we bring that as a principle in, it forces us to think outside of our field of vision, which is something that most of us don't do very often. And so I think that's an important principle to consider. There's a few others that Microsoft has, and rather than go into them, what I think I'd rather pivot to is the idea of practices as well as principles, because we talk a lot about principles, but unless you have the strategies and methodologies and the checklists, you're doing the assessments to make those principles practices, and actually how you're deploying AI, it's just a principle. And so it's important that we take principles, which most of us talk about for responsible AI, and actually implement them in our development and deployment.
Great. And on that note of practices, I'd love to talk a little bit about sort of the conditions that government needs in order to be able to put these principles into practice. What kind of governance structures, what kind of talent, what kind of data, what are some of the things that you both see as sort of groundwork to be able to implement and follow these AI practices? Kevin, I'll start with you and then we'll go over to Craig.
Sure, you mentioned talent for sure. When we think about talent, though, often we're only thinking about technical talent, and it goes beyond that. I wouldn't want, not that I'm not ethical, but I'm not an ethicist. And so there's a difference between being ethical and being an ethicist, right? So when you think about talent, you have to go beyond just the technical talent. You have to think of bringing in policy experts, particularly when you think of the public sector itself. There's regulatory and legal requirements which are far different than, say, we might have as Microsoft in some of our businesses in the private sector. So you would need people who are familiar with the legal concerns, policy concerns as well. I talked about ethics, those sorts of things. So it just goes beyond just technical talent. So I think those are some of the building blocks that we need to foster. Education, by the way, is also another one, because most people, I'll comment on that because ChatGPT has been in the news all over the place. And some of the criticisms, I think, are a riot because they're using a system model and trying to get mathematical calculations from it. And so education is a perfect example. Do people understand the AI systems that they're using? So that's another building block that I think the federal government can help with.
Craig, what do you see from your perspective as some of the things that governments need to have in place to make this happen?
Yeah, no, I think this is an important element, and I agree entirely with Kevin. I love this notion of sort of moving from principles to practice, because I think that's really important. It's one thing to have sort of a theoretical perspective or framework for what this might look like and what it should look like. It's a very different thing, right, to install and create a system, a mechanism, a process, a series of practices that begin to test and refine, actually what that looks like in real world application. When we have talked to, so I should give a little bit of just some quick context here. We have spent some time here in Austin with local city officials, government officials, different departments, Department of Transportation, Department of Housing, Public Health, for example, sort of probing, right, the ways in which they are in fact addressing this issue of responsible, fair, ethical AI. We were primarily concerned about some of the racial equity considerations associated with the technology. But what we've come to understand, right, is, some of the things that, for example, a local government might need is kind of in some respects, right, in addition to a more kind of interdisciplinary or kind of multidimensional team of experts. It was mentioned, having ethicists, designers, social scientists, a range of people who will ask different questions about an AI system and its application. I think we've now arrived at a point in terms of society where we understand that as these conversations are being held, as these decisions are being made, that it's no longer appropriate for only data scientists or computer scientists to be in the room, and that in fact we need different kinds of perspectives, bringing different kinds of expertise, asking different kinds of questions about ethics, about impact, about the sort of social scientific attributes associated with these systems and how they might impact different populations differently. And so I would say in some regards, right, what governments need is kind of a strategy and sort of understanding, right, what's the broader mission, what's the goal of this system, and how does it in some ways, what we've learned here in Austin, as the city is beginning, like a number of other cities, trying to think about racial equity in a much more comprehensive way, how might the adoption and deployment of these systems work within that kind of racial equity framework, and what might that mean?
Great. And you both started to talk about this, but I'd love to think a little bit more specifically about sort of what does it mean for AI in government in particular to be responsible? Public services operate in a unique context at any level of government. And would love to hear both of your perspective on what it means, for AI to be responsible when it's used by government versus AI to be responsible when it's, on a shopping website that I'm using. Craig, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think one way in which we've thought about this, right, is that when we think about governments, be they local, government, city government, state, or federal, is that they first and foremost have a responsibility to their citizens, right, to the people that they serve. And as a result of that, right, we know that historically, various, stages of government, be it local, state, or federal, have sometimes struggled when it comes to more equitable distribution of its resources, the ways in which it, sort of responds to the needs of different segments of the population. And so in that sense, right, I think as governments and government officials begin to understand, right, what it means to serve the public good, what it means to serve its citizens, I think the questions that this report identifies and the questions that this report, illuminates, I think are some compelling ones for governments to understand, right, specifically how these kinds of technologies can in some way support, but if we're not careful, undermine a government's capacity to serve its citizens in a way that is, thoughtful, in a way that is strategic, smart, connected, but also ethical and responsible as well.
Kevin, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think Craig is right on that, particularly, normally, the principles are going to be the same for private sector versus public sector. But I think the considerations that are unique is that whole idea of the public trust. Government provides essential services to its citizens. That's one of its primary functions. And so maintaining that public trust is crucial for those services to function. And if you don't have, if you don't have AI that's transparent, that's fair, if people start to think, hey, this is unfair, my group is not being served appropriately, or this group is being advantaged, if it starts not to align with the public interest, that erodes confidence in those systems pretty quickly. And that's not something that the government can afford, as a loss of confidence, right? Particularly for essential services and those things. So governments need to ensure that it's transparent, it's explainable, it respects the citizens' rights and so forth. A second one would be those legal concerns that I mentioned, because those are different. So government needs to address those differently than the private sector does. And because the costs are so high, I would say it's even more essential to have humans in the loop from an oversight perspective. So that data is being monitored continually, results are being monitored continually, so that if there is, and we are dealing with rapidly emerging technologies, right? So there are risks that we need to take, and we do need to be able to pivot quickly if we see something functioning outside of the bounds that we've set for ourselves.
Liz, could I also add,
Yeah.
I think another kind of critical element for government leaders and officials to take into consideration, this is certainly something that we learned in the study that we're doing with the City of Austin, is this question or matter of community engagement. And that is, the extent to which community members are involved, through that life cycle process that we were referring to earlier. I think many of us are kind of coming to the consensus that, as government leaders think about the application of these systems, to do so without public input, to do so without public comment or engagement is a substantially missed opportunity that oftentimes can lead to serious problems downstream in terms of lack of trust, in terms of not understanding what the system is being used for. By opening up public comment and giving community members a chance to be involved in the process, it also expands your opportunity to identify, right, where those areas of shortcomings might emerge in terms of understanding, how populations can best be served. What are some of the blind spots or biases in terms of this system or model or technology that you're using? And so I would hope, right, my vision is that in the not too distant future, 2, 3, 4, 5 years or so, that it would be a common practice, right, for government officials to include community engagement, to include public voice and comment in terms of how we proceed with integrating these systems into our sort of day-to-day lives.
Craig,
Absolutely.
Can I ask Craig a question on that? Sorry. So would you see that as actually beta testing also? Beyond just public comment to the service, but a lot, because some of these AI systems are complex, and until they're released into the wild, it's really difficult at times to understand how they work and how the public will use them.
No, I think that's certainly one interesting possibility or example of how one might engage the public. Beta testing, getting feedback before a more thorough or wide scale rollout or application of a system is facilitated. I think that certainly could be one way. Even sharing, right, with community members results, outputs, what kinds of decisions have been, created as a result of, what may have been learned from or recommended, from a system. And that in part, gets back, Kevin, to your note about, transparency, and also just your comments about, just being much more forthcoming with the public in terms of, the implications of these systems. But I think there are many different ways throughout this cycle or across this cycle in which the public might be consulted or engaged in a way that enhances proficiency in terms of performance. But I think equally important, right, enhancing understanding and trust, right, in terms of what these systems are designed to do and whether or not they are meeting those intentions in a way that lead to sort of equitable outcomes.
I love that point. I also work on the partnership's customer experience work, and we talk a lot about the importance of including customers in the design of any service. So certainly we'd want to be including them when we're talking about these emerging technologies, you know, these things that have real potential to be really, really powerful and have a lot of impact. You know, we've talked a lot about sort of what we want governments to do and what they should be doing, but would love to hear a little bit about sort of what the challenges might be to them doing that. Sort of what are the challenges that governments or government leaders might face in trying to follow these principles and practices that we've discussed. Kevin, I'll start with you.
Sure. I don't think the challenges sometimes that the government faces aren't necessarily unique to the government. In this particular case, at the partnership with the cohort that we're leading, the number one challenge absolutely was limited resources and budgets. And that's universal. You know, it takes a lot of investment to deal with these emerging technologies. If you start thinking about trying to do it responsibly, it's even more investment, because when you start talking about hiring ethicists, you know, nobody developing line of business applications is considering ethicists on their list of people to hire. But if you're talking about an AI system, you might want to think about something like that. So getting approval for those budgets, you know, if I can give a response to that and solve the problem, I probably wouldn't be sitting here having a conversation. You know, attracting a tech-savvy workforce is probably more unique to government because of they're competing with the private sector on some of that. But that's something that's important as well. And then, you know, I really do want to hone in on that idea of biases and blind spots, in particular when we talk about AI systems too, and challenges. Because most of us see the world from our own glasses, and if we're not really focused on bringing a solution for that is really developing diverse teams. And by diverse, I don't mean necessarily just look diverse, but diverse in terms of who they are. For instance, somebody could look totally different than I do, but if I didn't grow up with a brother or sister with, say, special needs, and let's say they did, they could look completely different than I did, or the same as I do, but have a completely different viewpoint because of dealing with accessibility, because they have a different background and upbringing, that sort of thing. So I think that focusing on some of that to build systems is really important, and it's a challenge to find those teams. It's not easy to build teams of people who, particularly when you're dealing with technologists who don't, even though they might look differently, who don't kind of have the same worldview of the world they're looking at. So those are some of the challenges I think that government has in particular.
Craig, would love to hear your thoughts on sort of the challenges government faces, and then if you have any thoughts on how to overcome those challenges. Although, as Kevin said, you know, we can't do much about those budget challenges.
Yeah, no, when you asked the question, the first thing that popped in my mind were the budgetary constraints, as Kevin alluded to. So I won't elaborate on those. You know, and I agree with everything that he has noted, and would similarly echo that. A couple of other things that I noted. You know, there's the question becomes, who's responsible for facilitating or designing the strategy, the procedures, or processes that a government office might undertake to make sure that it's actually, you know, moving, as Kevin said, from principles to practice. And that's something that we've come to understand in the research that we're doing, right, is that as it currently exists in most governments, for example, I'm thinking here primarily local and city, and maybe even state, the question becomes, right, you know, who's responsible, right, for asking these questions? Who's responsible for creating the frameworks, the playbook, or assembling the playbook that you know, that other staff members, you know, in a government office or department might then implement as a way of sort of executing and operating in a more responsible and ethical way when it comes to these systems. So I would say, for many governments, right, it's just creating, right? Is it a division? Is it a unit? Is it a task force? This idea, right, that well, we're all responsible, right, for responsible AI. I think we've come to understand, right, if everybody is responsible, then it probably means that ultimately no one is responsible. And so how do we begin to make that a very specific priority, right, within a government sort of structure and organization, I think is really important. And then the other thing that I have found fascinating in the conversation that we've been having, and this isn't just for government officials, it's for myself, I'm assuming this may be for you as well, is this need to sort of continue cultivating and promoting opportunities to grow our understanding of AI. So AI literacy, I think, is really critical. We make the assumption, right, that that when like a local government, you know, we heard some examples in the case studies that we're doing here in Austin. For example, in response to the early days of the pandemic, public health department wanted to use a chatbot to help sort of, you know, collect information and sort of understand how people were experiencing the pandemic. And yet there was really no kind of questioning, no procedure, no mechanism for understanding, right, a lot of the things that we might ask about a chatbot. You know, what kinds of data is it trained on? What kinds of, you know, outputs is it generating? And to what extent, right, is that data and outputs replicating, right, certain kinds of historical biases that may be embedded, right, in the ways in which the public health has typically responded, right, to a public health crisis. And so my point here, right, is that, you know, not making the assumption that everybody who's actually in charge of AI or who plays a role in sort of the deployment and application of AI really understands, right, these sort of questions around responsibility, ethics, and bias. And so just really kind of growing opportunities for city officials to develop their vocabulary, to develop stronger, more effective frameworks for being able just, I think, to ask the right questions, let alone arrive at what might be important solutions.
One of the things that we looked at in our research was collaboration between technical and non-technical leaders. To exactly that point, you know, we can have the ethicists and the lawyers in the room, but if nobody knows what the other person's talking about, that's not really very helpful, is it? So we'd love to hear from both of you, sort of your thoughts on that and how we can better facilitate collaboration between technologists and the other non-technical leaders whose perspective we want as part of this. Craig, I'll go back to you.
Yeah, I think that's a critical component, broadly speaking, no matter the context, if it's public, private sector, you know, whatever the domain is, right? Making sure that there is sort of interdisciplinary, kind of multidisciplinary expertise in the room and around the table. You know, asking, you know, very unique or distinctive or domain specific questions about a particular, you know, problem that AI is trying to solve, and the manner in which that AI is being designed to solve that problem. And so I think, right, creating opportunity, creating capacity for those with technical expertise to perhaps explain to those who may come from a non-technical perspective, you know, what is a model sort of intending to do? You know, what kinds of data inputs, you know, have gone into the design and articulation or expression of this model? And then, you know, what are the sort of mechanisms that we put in place to try to understand, you know, the performance of the model? And so to the extent, right, that can be articulated in a way that non-technical, you know, talent can understand, it then gives them a better sense of what the goal is, what the problem is that a technology is trying to solve. And so by bringing that sort of non-technical kind of expertise, let's say it's in public safety. And so you have, you know, experts in the room who understand, right, public safety, understand the ways in which the history of public safety has impacted different communities in different ways, understanding the ways in which, you know, data can sometimes be a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And so in that sense, beginning to, you know, work with the technical experts, the data scientists, to maybe think about, right, data infrastructure, to think about data inputs, think about data sets that are more representative, or data sets that are at least designed in some ways to mitigate what might potentially be those sort of bias biases or disparate impacts, that a data set might inadvertently lead to. And I think just creating that space and that opportunity, even the expectation that these are the kinds of cross-disciplinary conversations that we expect to have. I think everyone is enriched by that, and more importantly, I think the public good is certainly served as a result of a process like that.
Great. Kevin, anything you want to add on that as we wrap up?
I think Craig nailed it. I think the one attribute that I would look for in all those leaders is humility, because you need humility to recognize you don't know what you don't know, and to be able to listen and understand and hear what the other person's actually saying without necessarily looking to respond. And so part of that for me, even just building cross-functional teams at Microsoft, right? We're dealing in those, when you start to think about domain experts from whatever the domain is, when you start to think about legal experts or ethicists or technical experts, these are all highly competent people. And often highly competent people, sometimes highly competent people struggle with recognizing the limits of their competence or the boundaries of their competence. So, I would think educating and listening and hearing what other people are saying from those multidisciplinary approaches, and understanding and seeing the impact when we don't have a well-rounded solution, right? And seeing the outcomes from, say, AI that doesn't take, if I were to design an AI system and I'm not a domain expert in, say, health and safety, well, it's not going to be a very health or safe system. So I need a domain expert, and I think that's that humility to understand that multidisciplinary approach that Craig was talking about is critical.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Craig and Kevin, for this fantastic conversation. This has been really great. I encourage everyone to read the rest of the partnership and Microsoft's In the Public AI report. You can find that on our website, and hear more about the topics that we discussed today. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.